Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at Marvel Snap Zone, and welcome back to another weekly installment of our tier list, the series where we go over the best performing decks in Marvel Snap right now, and look at what makes them so strong in the current metagame. Overall, Week 2 of the Quantum Realm is following a very similar pattern to most developing metagames, eliminating a number of the decks underneath as the best decks rise to the cream of the crop and take more of the spotlight. The big question now is whether we are able to find some kind of reliable counter to these strategies in order to keep the metagame fresh, or whether we're about to start settling into the stale part of the Quantum Mania season as the dominant decks start staying put. If you do enjoy the tier list, I need you to do me a favour, leave a comment down below about what you think about Marvel Snap's current metagame, and just thoughts in general, I suppose. Make sure you subscribe to the channel here at Marvel Snap Zone so you aren't missing out on daily content for all things Marvel Snap. So let's head on in and take a look at the full tier list. As always, in order to be featured here, a deck needs to represent at least 1% of the current environment and have a positive cube average using data from the Marvel Snap Tracker. If a deck shows great performances but is a very limited presence in the metagame, you can find it in the Silent Performers section, which will appear just after this, where we'll highlight decks with an excellent cube per game ratio but too little of a sample size to represent their real strength. We have enough data this week to find a few decks in the budget and tier 4 tiers. Budget options looking much like they have over the past few weeks, to be honest. Hand size, ongoing, Sandman and Control. Deck lists are all available for you in the article down below. Tier 4 this week finds just decks trending downwards, truth be told. Cerebro 2 and Hella Discard really not able to keep up with the rest of the metagame right now, find themselves consigned to being an off-meta choice instead. Tier 3, a small amount of decks here. Again, the field really dwindling this week, truth be told. Negative Zabu and Dracula Discard making up Tier 3. Negative Zabu on the way down, really not holding its own against the rest of the field. Discard Dracula unable to break through the ceiling of Tier 3 due to its lack of flexibility. Tier 2 this week contains a number of haymakers. Deathwave and Galactus remain the bar of what you are allowed to play in Marvel Snap right now at a majority of collection levels, performing at a reasonable level all around and grinding a slow but impressive grind up the ladder in 2 to 4 cube chunks. Lockjaw Thor or Lock-Thor, whichever you prefer, trending downwards a little bit this week, falling down by the wayside of its alternative in the form of the Thanos deck, but still putting up a fantastic show for those players who are in the Series 3 kind of collection levels and MMR, and a great way to excel your way to infinite if that's where you find yourself. The ongoing version of Thanos finds itself at the top of Tier 2 as an alternative to the Lockjaw deck. Whether or not this is mostly due to the featured location of the Quantum Tunnel, or whether this is also performing exceptionally well just overall as people have rediscovered the power of Lockjaw, remains to be seen. Tier 1 this week, however, is a bit of a stronghold. Shuri Zero, Zabu Darkhawk and Lockjaw Thanos kind of holding and lording a huge amount of players over the rest of the tier list, with Lockjaw Thanos being the breakout deck during the featured location and continuing to massively overperform following it leaving the game. This week's silent performers of the week are Valkyrie Control, Zabu Control and Electro Ramp. Quite the fall from grace for Zabu Control, now down to less than 1% of the metagame. Disruption clearly still exists in Marvel Snap and appears to be pretty strong if you're only looking at the results. The problem with these archetypes that are based on reaction or that look to deny their opponent's game plan is their popularity overall. Our assumption is that these decks are more complicated to play, and it's fairly demoralizing when opponents start learning your play patterns, because it takes a bit of time to get comfortable with them anyway. The need to recognize what your opponent is up to and anticipate the coming turns in order to create a perfect setup is unfortunately not as simple as playing the proactive deck. Considering there are juggernauts like Lockjaw and Shuri around, it's hard to fault anyone for not wanting to play a more complicated deck. However, I would highly recommend investing some time in these if you're done with your competitive goals this season, as it may be where the metagame is heading. Electro Ramp is definitely the easier of the three decks to play than the other two, as it racks up cubes by playing an early leech against nearly everybody that isn't Lockjaw Thanos or Shuri. The three decks still seem to be worth investing some time into, as Zabu Control is worthy of a tier 1 status with its results alone if it had more players, and the other two would likely fall somewhere near the bottom of tier 2. Okay, so let's start breaking down these decks deck by deck, starting with Lockjaw Thanos, the new emerging kingpin of Marvel Snap and the best deck of the week, in our opinion, according to the data. The Quantum Tunnel probably has a lot to do with Lockjaw Thanos taking the top spot of our rankings this week, but even then, the deck's strength is undeniable based on its performance following that location leaving the game. Compared to last week's Shuri Zero, which dominated based on the sheer number of points it can play, this deck is all about flexibility. Don't be fooled. Lockjaw Thanos can still develop a stupid amount of points. It's also able to mix up its various abilities into its game plan though, with cards like Magneto, Leech and Arrow. Also, the way the deck develops its points is much sneakier, as they can come from cheap units being played behind a Lockjaw, or from an explosive turn 6, courtesy of She-Hulk plus Devil Dinosaur, or Arrow with She-Hulk instead. We'll see how this deck performs when it doesn't have a 48-hour long window of being the absolute best thing you can do due to a featured location, but it is looking exceptionally solid right now. Moving down to Zabu Darkhawk, with most of the attention centered on Lockjaw Thanos and Shuri Zero, Darkhawk is climbing to be one of the most popular and strongest cards when looking at the cost to power ratio. Alongside Devil Dinosaur, the deck is definitely scared of a Shang-Chi, but it can play with their power to try and avoid it. And more importantly, Enchantress really isn't anywhere to be seen. I'm curious to see whether Darkhawk has a chance at taking over the metagame when he drops down to Series 4 very soon. Our other tier 1 contender remains the big bad in the form of Shuri Zero. If it was just a competition on which deck can develop the most points, Shuri Zero would probably have retained the top spot in the rankings this week. But with Shang-Chi as the default tech card for most players, there are too many matches where the deck can only dominate one lane and it gets punished for coveting a second one. If the list with Armor and Cosmo becomes more popular, that trend might change, and then Shuri Zero will likely go back to being the top dog in Marvel Snap. Moving down into tier number 2, we have Thanos Ongoing Zoo, a deck that was part of the Silent Performers category last week. It's definitely picked up an interest this week and collected enough data to give it some deserved recognition. Whether that's mostly due to the Quantum Tunnel or not, again, remains to be seen. Also, this really clearly puts Thanos in the conversation for the best card in the current metagame, as it finally has a second archetype represented by more than a mere fraction of the meta overall. Looking forward to seeing if this one can hold its place, or whether it really is a flash in the pan. Lock-Thor finds itself in tier 2 this week. Lockjaw Thanos really seemed to dominate, but Lock-Thor is still very good if you don't own that Series 5 card yet. The deck is a little less high-rolly overall, since you can't dump stones behind Lockjaw and use their abilities, but it still packs plenty of potential to win some games. We actually made a video about this one just yesterday, and is up on the channel with some gameplay for you right now if you want to go and check it out. It could also, of course, be the Quantum Tunnel effect on this deck as well, but I think, personally, it performed quite well once that location had disappeared, so I expect this one to remain a staple in the metagame going forward. Up next, we find ourselves with a little bit of Galactus. It feels like most players who are playing and enjoying Galactus are trying to mix things up to disguise their true potential lately, which kind of makes the Galactus archetype a bit of a mess to understand at the moment. There are even lists that aim to play Galactus on turn 6 and create a huge Wolverine before that point to contest the remaining lane. Nonetheless, it seems to work out quite well, and Galactus remains a strong contender in the metagame right now. The big problem card to solve for this deck is Arrow. The card is often able to completely negate Galactus when played with priority, and Cosmo showing up in some decks in order to protect from Shang-Chi is another problem that Galactus has to face if it wants to contend for a tier 1 space. There are so many versions of Galactus around these days, it's hard to give you precise replacements for this archetype, or even what a single list looks like. It really depends on how you envision the path towards playing Galactus for maximum efficiency. Deathwave finds itself in Tier 2 once again this week, keeping its place among the most popular decks in the game, especially in the 80 to 100 rank range. In that specific part of the ladder, the deck seems to do very well, and with Thanos' rise to priority, Killmonger is gaining a ton of value overall, including reducing your death down to 0 very easily. Once you start going a little higher on the ladder though, you should be met with more Sunspot plus armor combinations once again, and the deck seems to see its cube rate plummet. Varied results are very dependent on which part of the ladder you find yourself in for this deck right now, which seems to indicate that Deathwave is a good middle of the pack deck and deserves a place in Tier 2. The top of Tier 3 begins with Dracula Discard. It just doesn't seem like the Discard synergy can push past Tier 3 for now, as the inflexibility towards the various locations is holding this archetype back a little bit too much. Also, Leech in the Lockjaw Thanos deck really seems to be an instant retreat for this one, while Shang-Chi can take out your big Morbius, and that isn't the best feeling either. There's definitely a need for Discard to find a way to be more unpredictable, or at least more flexible if it wants to succeed, for one of the most popular decks below the infinite rank to get higher in the rankings once above it. Quite a tumble for Negative Surfer here as well. It seems the Surfer list that has prevailed over the other builds is still centered around Mr. Negative, even if the results for that aren't particularly stellar. For now, the ability to snap hands to have a turn 3 Mr. Negative seems like just enough to keep the deck above water in the cube average environment. The win rate for this deck, though, is by far the worst this week at only 42% according to our data. Even if it seems kind of hard to beat the best decks without specifically tailored tech cards right now, the metagame definitely feels like it's more about build-around card packages than rigid 12-card decks right now. As such, there's a lot of ways to bring your personal touch to an archetype, instead of being forced to play the most popular deck the same way everyone else is playing it. This particular point in the current Marvel Snap metagame feels very satisfying as a result, and can lead to rewarding deck building choices even when playing one of the more popular decks in the game. Another interesting topic is the role of disruptive archetypes in the current metagame. Shang-Chi has already established himself as a premium tech card versus Shuri Zero, and Zabu Control performs extremely well despite its very low popularity. With Lockjaw and Thanos taking on a larger role this week, I'm curious if the junk archetype built around Debris, Viper and Green Goblin can gain some traction by polluting lanes in order to be a reliable counter. I guess we'll have to wait till next week to find out. As usual, if you want to talk about this tier list or anything Marvel Snap, you can come and join us in the community Discord server with thousands of other players talking Marvel Snap 24/7. Alternatively, if you want to talk to the team directly, you can do just that by finding us on Twitter at Marvel Snap Zone, or you can come and find DenCCG or myself at HowlingMines. But until next time, I have been HowlingMines. You have been amazing, and this has been Marvel Snap Zone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.